Tension in the congressional hearing room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Senator Marsha Blackburn, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp navy suit, sat at the committee table with that familiar smirk that had intimidated dozens of politicians over the years. She had just delivered what she thought was the knockout punch of her political career. Maybe if the gentlewoman from Texas had actually read a book instead of just tweeting all day, she'd understand basic economics, Blackburn had said, her Tennessee drawl dripping with condescension as she gestured dismissively toward the younger congresswoman. The words hung in the air like poison. Every camera in the room zoomed in on the two women. The reporters held their breath. Even the stenographers stopped typing and looked up in shock. But what happened next left everyone in that room absolutely speechless. What Jasmine Crockett pulled out in response didn't just silence Blackburn. It completely destroyed her credibility and may have changed the entire direction of American politics forever. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And neither woman knew that in the next 20 minutes, one career would be elevated to legendary status, while another would face the most embarrassing moment in recent congressional history. Before we dive into this incredible story that has the entire political world talking, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button so you never miss these explosive political moments that everyone's buzzing about. To understand just how shocking what happened next was, you need to know exactly who these two women are and why this confrontation mattered so much to the future of American politics. Senator Marsha Blackburn had built her entire political brand on being the smart, experienced conservative voice that could put anyone in their place. At 71 years old, she'd spent decades climbing the political ladder in Tennessee, starting from local politics and working her way up to the United States Senate. She loved reminding people about her business background, her years in the state legislature, and her reputation as someone who tells it like it is. Blackburn had a particular talent for making younger politicians, especially women of color, feel small and insignificant. She would use her age, her experience, and her position to talk down to them like they were students in her classroom rather than equals in the halls of power. It was a strategy that had worked for her countless times before. On this particular day, she'd come prepared for what she thought would be easy prey. The committee was discussing a complex economic development bill, and Blackburn had done her homework. She had charts, statistics, and that confident smile that said she was about to school everyone in the room about how the real world actually works. But sitting across from her was someone who represented everything that threatened Blackburn's old god politics. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas was only 42 years old, but she had already made waves in Washington with her sharp questioning and her refusal to back down from anyone. Crockett was young, black, outspoken, and had a massive social media following that hung on her every word. She represented a new generation of politicians who didn't respect the old hierarchies just because they were old. But here's what Blackburn didn't know, and what would soon become painfully obvious to everyone watching. Crockett wasn't just another young politician riding on charisma and social media popularity. She had earned her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, graduating with honors. She'd spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting cases that required her to master complex legal arguments and face down opponents who underestimated her daily. She'd built her career on being underestimated and then systematically destroying that perception with cold, hard facts and laser-focused preparation. She had learned long ago that when people attack your intelligence, the best response isn't anger, it's proof. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about economic policy or committee business. This was about respect, representation, and whether the old ways of doing politics could survive in the modern era. For Blackburn, it was about maintaining her image as the wise elder stateswoman who could put young upstarts in their place. For Crockett, it was about proving that intelligence and capability weren't determined by age, race, or how many years you'd been in Washington. The room was packed with reporters from every major news organization. Cameras were positioned at every angle, ready to capture whatever fireworks were about to happen. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation because everyone who followed politics knew that these two women represented completely different visions of what American leadership should look like. Everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. They just had no idea how big. The hearing had started normally enough. The committee was discussing a new economic development bill that would provide tax incentives and grants to small businesses in underserved communities. Members were taking turns asking questions and making statements, following the usual congressional procedures that most Americans find boring, but Marsha Blackburn had been building up to her moment all morning. She wasn't interested in the boring procedural stuff. She had come to this hearing with a plan to establish her dominance and put the young congresswoman from Texas in her place. First, she started with subtle jabs. When discussing the cost projections in the bill, she made comments like, "I'm concerned that some of my colleagues don't fully grasp the long-term fiscal implications of this kind of spending." Her eyes would sweep the room, but always seemed to linger on Crockett, making it clear who she was talking about without saying it directly. Then she moved to questioning the implementation timeline. "Having run businesses in the real world," she said with emphasis, adjusting her reading glasses dramatically. "Unlike some people in this room who went straight from law school to politics, I understand what actually works in practice versus what sounds good in theory." The comment was clearly directed at Crockett, and everyone in the room knew it. But Crockett just sat there calmly, taking notes, occasionally whispering to her chief of staff. She showed no reaction to Blackburn's increasingly pointed comments, which seemed to frustrate the Tennessee senator even more. What Blackburn didn't realize was that behind Crockett's calm exterior, she was methodically cataloging every slight, every assumption, every condescending remark. Her legal training had taught her to never react emotionally in the moment, but instead to build an airtight case that would demolish her opponent when the time was right. During the 15-minute break, the tension was palpable. Reporters could be heard whispering in the gallery. "Blackburn's setting something up." One veteran political journalist muttered to his colleague. "She's been gunning for Crockett all morning. This is going to get ugly." But something else was happening during that break that would prove crucial to what came next. Crockett's chief of staff was quietly sliding her a thick folder filled with research they had prepared weeks earlier. They had anticipated this exact scenario. Blackburn was known throughout Washington for her condescending attacks on younger colleagues, especially women of color. "She's walking right into it," Crockett whispered to her aide with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Just like we thought she would." They had done opposition research that would make a presidential campaign proud. They had voting records, business filings, educational transcripts, tax records, attendance sheets, everything they might need if Blackburn decided to make this personal. When the session resumed, Blackburn escalated her attacks even further. She began questioning specific provisions in the bill, using complex economic terminology, and speaking slowly, as if she were explaining basic concepts to children who couldn't possibly understand. "Perhaps some of my colleagues need me to break this down more simply," she said, pulling out a calculator and making an exaggerated show of doing basic math that any high school student could handle. The other committee members were growing visibly uncomfortable. Even some of Blackburn's Republican colleagues were shifting in their seats, recognizing that she was crossing lines of basic professional respect. The Democratic members looked angry, but were waiting to see how Crockett would handle the situation. But Blackburn was too intoxicated by her own perceived superiority to notice the warning signs. She was enjoying herself too much, finally getting the chance to put this young upstart in her place in front of the entire nation. Senator Blackburn interrupted the committee chairman, clearly trying to restore some decorum to the proceedings. "Perhaps we could focus on the specific provisions of the bill rather than I'm very focused, Mr. Chairman." Blackburn cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I'm focused on making sure we have informed discussions in this committee, not social media sound bites and empty talking points." That comment drew sharp looks from several committee members, including some Republicans who recognized the barely veiled racism and suggesting that a black congresswoman was only capable of creating social media soundbites rather than substantive policy discussions. The tension in the room was now electric. Everyone could sense that this was building towards something explosive, but no one knew exactly when or how it would happen. It was during the discussion of tax incentives that things finally reached the breaking point. Crockett had made a detailed policy argument about how the bill would benefit small businesses in underserved communities. She cited specific data from her district, referenced relevant economic studies, and provided concrete examples of how similar programs had succeeded in other states. "In my district alone," Crockett had said, consulting her carefully prepared notes. "We have over 2,000 small businesses that would benefit from these tax incentives. The economic impact study conducted by the Regional Planning Commission shows this could create approximately 15,000 new jobs over the next 3 years, with an average wage increase of 18% for workers in these communities." It was exactly the IECA kind of detailed fact-based argument that demonstrated thorough preparation and deep understanding of the issues. Any reasonable person would have engaged with the substance of her points or asked follow-up questions about the data. But Marsha Blackburn saw this as her perfect opportunity to deliver what she thought would be the killing blow. She leaned forward in her chair, that condescending smile spreading across her face like she had just spotted a wounded animal she was about to finish off. "Well, that's a very interesting perspective," she said, emphasizing the word interesting in a way that made it sound like the most insulting thing she could possibly say. But perhaps the gentlewoman from Texas should leave the complex economic analysis to those of us who actually understand how business works in the real world. The room went dead silent. Even the stenographer looked up from her keyboard in shock. It was a direct personal attack that questioned not just Crockett's policy argument, but her fundamental competence to participate in congressional business. But Crockett still didn't take the bait. She simply nodded calmly and made another note on her legal pad, as if Blackburn had just made a routine procedural comment rather than a personal insult. This response seemed to infuriate Blackburn even more. She had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even tears. Instead, she was getting the political equivalent of being completely ignored, which was somehow even more insulting than being argued with. Furthermore, Blackburn continued, her voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I think it's important that when we're discussing matters of this complexity and importance, we rely on experience and actual knowledge rather than campaign promises and wishful thinking." Other committee members were now openly uncomfortable. The ranking minority member cleared his throat loudly, trying to signal Blackburn to back down before she did permanent damage to her own reputation. A Democratic colleague raised her eyebrows in obvious disapproval and shook her head slowly. But Blackburn was beyond noticing social cues or caring about consequences. She had convinced herself that she was winning this confrontation, that her experience and authority were shining through and putting this young upstart exactly where she belonged. In her mind, she was the wise elder putting a presumptuous child in her place. She couldn't see that to everyone else in the room. She looked like a bully picking on someone half her age simply because she felt threatened by her intelligence and competence. That's when Marsha Blackburn made the fatal mistake that would define the rest of this hearing and possibly the rest of her political career. Unable to provoke the emotional reaction she wanted, unable to make Crockett look foolish or unprepared, she decided to abandon all pretense of professional behavior and go for the most personal, insulting attack she could think of. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice rising to almost a shout, her face flushed with frustration and anger. "I think it's clear that we have some members on this committee who simply aren't prepared for this level of discussion." She paused for dramatic effect, clearly enjoying what she thought was her moment of triumph. Maybe if the gentlewoman from Texas had actually read a book instead of just tweeting all day, she'd understand basic economics. The words exploded across the room like a bomb going off. The silence that followed was so complete and so shocked that it felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Even the reporters stopped typing. Even the cameras seemed to freeze. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The personal attack was so blatant, so inappropriate, and so obviously rooted in prejudice that even some of Blackburn's Republican allies were visibly shaking their heads in disgust and embarrassment. This wasn't political discourse. This was pure undisguised disrespect of the most toxic kind. Blackburn sat back in her chair with a satisfied smile, clearly pleased with what she thought was a devastating blow. She had questioned Crockett's intelligence, her work ethic, her preparation, and her fitness for office all in one sentence. She looked around the room, expecting to see nods of approval from her colleagues. Instead, she saw shock, disapproval, and embarrassment on faces throughout the room. Even her own staff members were staring at their phones, probably already trying to figure out damage control strategies for the political disaster their boss had just created. But as she basked in what she thought was victory, she failed to notice the most important thing happening in that room. Jasmine Crockett had stopped taking notes. She had put down her pen, closed her folder, and was now staring directly at Blackburn with a look that would have made a seasoned trial lawyer nervous. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 seconds. The chairman, clearly uncomfortable and probably calculating the political fallout from what had just happened, finally managed to clear his throat. "Well," he said hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "does the gentlewoman from Texas wish to respond to the comments from the senator from Tennessee?" The way he phrased the question made it clear that even he recognized Blackburn had crossed every line of professional behavior. He wasn't asking if she wanted to continue the policy discussion. He was giving her a chance to defend herself from a personal attack that everyone in the room had witnessed. Crockett looked around the room slowly, taking in the shocked faces, the uncomfortable shifting in chairs, the barely contained outrage from her Democratic colleagues, and the embarrassed expressions on the faces of the Republican members who knew their colleague had just disgraced herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who was about to change the entire dynamic of not just this hearing, but possibly American politics itself. "You know what, Mr. Chairman," she said, rising slowly from her seat like a lawyer about to deliver a closing argument that would determine the fate of her client. "I think I would very much like to respond. What happened next would go down as one of the most devastating political responses in congressional history." Jasmine Crockett stood up slowly, deliberately, like a seasoned attorney who had just been handed the perfect opening by an overconfident opposing counsel. The room was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop 3 floors down. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "Well, Senator Blackburn," she began, her eyes never leaving the older woman's face. "Since you brought up reading habits and intellectual preparation, let me share some of my recent reading list with the committee." What came next was a masterclass in intellectual destruction delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a sledgehammer. Just last week, I finished reading the Federal Reserve's latest comprehensive report on regional economic disparities and their impact on small business development. It's an 847-page document with detailed statistical analysis and policy recommendations. Perhaps you missed it between your fundraising events, but it directly contradicts several of the assumptions you've been making all morning about small business lending patterns. Blackburn's confident smile began to falter slightly, but she tried to maintain her composure, probably thinking this was just the beginning of some defensive rambling that she could easily dismiss. She was wrong. I also recently completed a thorough review of the Congressional Budget Office's analysis of similar economic development programs in 12 other states. You know, the comprehensive study that shows these types of targeted investments generate an average return of 3.22:1 over 5 years with job creation rates exceeding projections by an average of 23%. But I suppose peer-reviewed economic analysis is just Twitter math to you. Crockett began walking around the committee table, never breaking eye contact with Blackburn. The cameras followed her every step, capturing what would become one of the most watched congressional moments of the decade. And since we're talking about preparation and intellectual rigor, let me tell you what else I've been reading recently. I spent last weekend going through the complete voting records of every member of this committee for the past 5 years. Very enlightening material, I must say. The other committee members were now sitting up straight in their chairs, suddenly wondering if they were about to be dragged into this political execution. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. But most interesting of all, Senator, was the research I did into your own background and qualifications. See, when someone questions my intelligence and my fitness to participate in serious policy discussions, I like to understand exactly where that criticism is coming from. This is when Crockett revealed that she hadn't just done her homework. She had brought enough ammunition to destroy Blackburn's credibility for the rest of her political career. She opened the folder that her chief of staff had given her during the break, and what she revealed would be talked about in political circles for decades to come. Let's start with your voting record, shall we? In 2019, you voted against the Small Business Innovation Research Program reauthorization. You know, the program that has helped create over 40,000 jobs in your own state of Tennessee and brought more than $32 billion in federal investment to Tennessee businesses over the past decade. Blackburn tried to interrupt, opening her mouth to offer some explanation, but Crockett held up her hand with the authority of a judge controlling her courtroom. "Oh, I'm not finished, Senator. You wanted to discuss my qualifications in preparation, so let's discuss them thoroughly and completely. Her voice remained perfectly calm, but there was steel beneath the silk that everyone in the room could feel. In 2020, you opposed the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund expansion despite the fact that this program has brought over $2 billion in investment specifically to rural Tennessee communities. Communities that, according to your own campaign website, you claim to champion and represent. The room was electric now. Reporters were frantically typing on their laptops, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the typically stoic committee chairman was leaning forward, clearly riveted by the systematic dismantling taking place before his eyes. And in 2021, you voted against the Minority Business Development Agency expansion, even though minority-owned businesses in Tennessee employ over 150,000 people and contribute $18 billion annually to your state's economy. Some of the Republican members were now looking at their phones, probably already getting frantic calls from their staff about how to distance themselves from Blackburn's comments and the retaliation they had provoked. So, I'm curious, Senator, when you talk about understanding how business works in the real world, are these the business decisions you're referring to? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've consistently voted against programs that actually help businesses succeed and create jobs. But Crockett was just getting warmed up. She had saved the most devastating revelations for the main course. Since you seem so concerned about educational credentials and intellectual preparation, let me share what I discovered about your own academic background. She consulted another page in her folder, her movements deliberate and confident like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Despite all your talk about understanding economics and business, you never actually completed your business degree, did you, Senator? According to records from Mississippi State University, you dropped out in your junior year in 1973. The gasp that went through the room was audible and immediate. Blackburn's face had gone from condescending confidence to something approaching panic in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that choice, Crockett continued, her voice still maddeningly calm and reasonable. People make different decisions about their education for all kinds of valid reasons. But it is rather interesting that someone who questions others about reading books and understanding complex subjects never actually finished reading the books required for her own degree program. Blackburn finally found her voice, attempting to stammer something about life experience and practical knowledge being more important than classroom theory, but it was too late. The damage was done, and everyone in the room knew there was no coming back from this. Oh, but it gets much more interesting, Crockett said, flipping to another page with the confidence of someone who had prepared for every possible angle of attack. You love to mention your business background and your success as an entrepreneur. So, let's examine that claim, shall we? What happened next would be studied in political science classes for decades as an example of how thorough preparation can completely destroy an opponent's credibility. Your marketing company, Marketing Strategies, which you prominently feature in your official biography and frequently mention in speeches. According to Tennessee state business records, it was dissolved in 1998 for failure to pay state taxes. The successful business you ran defaulted on over $30,000 in state tax obligations before finally being shut down by state authorities. The silence in the room was now deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Blackburn's face had gone completely pale and she was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. And speaking of business acumen, Crockett continued relentlessly. Let's talk about your track record right here in Congress. In the past 2 years, you've missed 47% of committee hearings. For someone so concerned about preparation and understanding complex issues, you certainly miss a lot of opportunities to actually learn about the subjects you're supposed to be voting on. The Republican committee members were now actively avoiding eye contact with Blackburn. One was visibly shaking his head in what appeared to be disgust or embarrassment. Another was scrolling through his phone, probably looking at the social media explosion that was already beginning. But Crockett still wasn't finished. She had saved the most devastating accusations for the grand finale. Since you felt comfortable questioning my intelligence and my understanding of economics, Senator, let me ask you about some of your recent public statements on economic policy. She turned to face Blackburn directly, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. 3 weeks ago at a public forum in Nashville, you stated that inflation was caused by too many people having good-paying jobs. Do you remember saying that? Because I have the video right here on my phone if you need your memory refreshed. She held up her phone and for a moment it looked like she might actually play the clip for everyone to hear. That statement demonstrates either a complete misunderstanding of basic economic principles or a callous disregard for working families. Either way, it raises serious questions about your fitness to make economic policy for the American people. Last month, you stated on record that raising the minimum wage would destroy small businesses across Tennessee, despite the fact that your own state's Department of Economic Development published a study just 6 months ago showing that the 5 Tennessee counties that implemented higher local minimum wages saw small business growth outpace the state average by 23%. Blackburn was now slumped in her chair, her earlier confidence completely evaporated like morning mist in the sun. The woman who had entered this hearing room thinking she would humiliate a young colleague was now being systematically destroyed by her own record, her own words, and her own failures. So, Senator Blackburn, Crockett said, returning to her seat, but remaining standing as she delivered what everyone knew would be the final blow. Before you ever question my intelligence, my preparation, or my qualifications again, maybe you should ask yourself a few simple questions. Her voice rose slightly, carrying clearly to every corner of the room and every camera that was broadcasting this moment to the nation. Which one of us actually finished their education? Which one of us actually reads the reports and studies that inform the votes we cast? Which one of us shows up to do the work that the people elected us to do? Which one of us has a record of supporting policies that actually help businesses and create jobs? The silence was so complete that it felt like the entire building was holding its breath. And most importantly, she continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of righteous indignation. Which one of us came to this hearing today prepared with actual facts and evidence? And which one of us came with nothing but condescension, prejudice, and assumptions? She sat down slowly, opened her folder to a fresh page, picked up her pen, and calmly resumed taking notes as if she had just finished discussing the weather instead of delivering one of the most thorough political destructions in congressional history. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Blackburn sat there staring straight ahead, her mouth slightly open, clearly in shock from what had just happened to her. The woman she had expected to easily intimidate and humiliate had just systematically dismantled not only her credibility, but her entire political persona in front of the entire nation. The other committee members sat in stunned silence. Even Crockett's Democratic colleagues, who had been hoping she would stand up to Blackburn's attack, seemed genuinely shocked by the thoroughness and devastating precision of her response. The chairman looked around the room helplessly, clearly struggling to figure out how to proceed after witnessing what might have been the most one-sided political confrontation in congressional history. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to clear his throat and stammer. Well, I think perhaps we should move on to the next item of business on our agenda. But everyone in that room knew there was no moving on from what they had just witnessed. The old rules of political engagement had just been rewritten by a 42-year-old congresswoman who had turned a condescending attack into a masterclass in how to destroy someone's credibility using nothing but facts, preparation, and surgical precision. As the committee tried to continue with other business, Blackburn remained silent for the rest of the 3-hour hearing. She didn't ask another question, didn't make another comment, didn't even look up from her papers. She had been so thoroughly defeated that she seemed to have forgotten how to participate in the very process she had claimed to understand better than everyone else. Meanwhile, Crockett continued to actively participate in the hearing, as if nothing unusual had happened. She asked substantive questions about other provisions in the bill, offered thoughtful amendments based on her district's needs, and demonstrated exactly the kind of preparation, intelligence, and policy expertise that Blackburn had claimed she lacked. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more damaging to Blackburn's reputation. The young congresswoman who had been attacked for being unprepared was now leading substantive policy discussions while the experienced senator who had launched the attack was sitting in mortified silence. Apparently too devastated to continue performing her basic duties as a committee member. Within minutes of the hearing ending, social media exploded with the force of a nuclear bomb. The video clip of Crockett's response was being shared at a rate that broke previous records for political content, reaching millions of viewers in Tanyon, the first hour alone. But this wasn't just another viral political moment that would be forgotten in a few days. This was something that would fundamentally reshape how political discourse happens in America and redefine the careers of both women involved. The hashtag #SheCrockett destroys Blackburn shot to #1 trending not just nationally but globally within 45 minutes. Political observers, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens across the political spectrum were sharing the footage and commenting on what many were calling the most devastating political takedown in modern American history. "I've covered politics for 30 years, tweeted one veteran political journalist with over 800,000 followers. "I have never seen anything like what Jasmine Crockett just did to Marsha Blackburn. This wasn't just a response to an insult. It was a systematic demolition of everything Blackburn claims to represent." The tweet was shared over 100,000 times in the first 2 hours, with comments ranging from shocked disbelief to pure admiration for Crockett's performance. Conservative commentators found themselves in the unusual position of having to defend the indefensible. Several prominent right-wing voices tried to frame Blackburn's comments as legitimate criticism rather than personal attacks, but even many Republican voters weren't buying it. "Look, I'm a conservative and I usually support Blackburn," wrote one popular conservative blogger, "but there's no defending what she did today. She walked into that hearing room unprepared, made assumptions about a colleague based on her age and race, and got absolutely destroyed by someone who actually did her homework." Meanwhile, liberal commentators were having a field day. The clip was being analyzed frame by frame on every major news program, with political scientists calling it a textbook example of how preparation and composure can overcome prejudice and condescension. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from congressional staff members and political insiders who had worked in Washington for decades. These were people who had seen every kind of political confrontation imaginable, but even they were stunned by what had happened. "I've been working on Capitol Hill for 22 years. One senior Democratic staffer told a reporter on condition of anonymity. "I've seen members get into heated arguments. I've seen personal attacks. I've seen some pretty ugly moments. But I have never seen anyone get as thoroughly destroyed as Marsha Blackburn just got destroyed. And the worst part for her is that she did it to herself." The political implications were immediate and far-reaching. Within 6 hours of the hearing ending, Crockett's campaign fundraising website had crashed from the volume of traffic. Small dollar donations were pouring in from all 50 states, with donors specifically citing her brilliant defense against racist attacks and her refusal to back down from bullies. By the end of the first day, she had raised over $2.3 million from more than 45,000 individual donors, making it one of the most successful single-day fundraising efforts by any member of Congress in recent memory. The money wasn't just coming from traditional Democratic donors. Political analysts noted that a significant portion of the contributions were coming from suburban women, young professionals, and even some Republican voters who were disgusted by Blackburn's behavior and impressed by Crockett's response. "Showed that you don't have to just take it when someone tries to humiliate you," said one suburban mother from Virginia, who donated $50 to Crockett's campaign despite never having contributed to a political candidate before. "She stood up for herself and she did it with class and facts. That's the kind of leader I want representing my daughter's generation." For Blackburn, the aftermath was a public relations nightmare that seemed to get worse with each passing hour. Her office initially released a brief statement saying she stood by her comments and was disappointed by the uncivil tone of the response, but that only made things worse. "Uncivil tone?" responded one political commentator on social media. Blackburn questioned a colleague's intelligence and fitness for office based on racist stereotypes. And when that colleague responded with documented facts about Blackburn's own record, suddenly Blackburn is concerned about civility. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Major news networks were scrambling to book both women for interviews. But the requests were telling. Producers wanted Crockett on their programs to discuss substantive policy issues and her vision for the future of the Democratic Party. They wanted Blackburn primarily to ask her to explain and defend her comments. Crockett's office was fielding dozens of requests from serious news programs, policy forums, and academic conferences. Political science departments at major universities were asking her to speak about effective political communication and how younger politicians can handle attempts at intimidation. Blackburn's team, meanwhile, was in full damage control mode, declining most interview requests and trying to change the subject to other topics. When she did appear on friendly news programs, the interviews were painful to watch as she struggled to explain her comments without making things even worse. The Tennessee Democratic Party immediately began using the clip in fundraising emails and social media campaigns, sensing an opportunity to use Blackburn's embarrassment against her in future elections. They created a targeted digital advertising campaign highlighting the exchange with the tagline "Tennessee deserves better than politicians who attack their colleagues instead of doing their jobs." The campaign was particularly effective in Tennessee's urban and suburban areas where Blackburn was already facing growing opposition from younger, more diverse voters who saw her as representing an outdated brand of politics. Republican strategists across the country were privately expressing serious concern about the broader implications of the incident. Several told reporters on condition of anonymity that Blackburn's performance was exactly the kind of thing that turned off the suburban voters and college-educated women that the Republican Party was already struggling to attract. "This is our worst nightmare," one senior Republican strategist said. "You have an older white politician making condescending, arguably racist comments toward a younger black woman and then getting completely destroyed when she fights back with facts and preparation. It reinforces every negative stereotype about our party that we're trying to overcome." The incident also sparked broader conversations about generational change in American politics, the persistence of racism and sexism in political discourse, and the importance of preparation over posturing in public debates. Political science professors immediately began incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of how political communication was evolving in the social media age. The old tactics of relying on seniority and assumed authority were no longer sufficient when opponents could fact-check your record in real time and present evidence of your failures to millions of viewers instantly. "This represents a fundamental shift in how political confrontations work," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a political communications professor at a major university. Senator Blackburn was using tactics that might have worked 20 or 30 years ago when information was harder to access and verify, but Congresswoman Crockett came prepared with receipts and she had the communication skills to present them in a way that was devastating but professional. It's a new model for how younger politicians can defend themselves against attempts at intimidation. The exchange also became a case study in effective crisis communication. Rather than getting defensive or emotional in response to a personal attack, Crockett had remained calm, focused on facts, and turned her opponent's aggression into a demonstration of her own competence and preparation. Young politicians across the country began studying the video, taking notes on how Crockett had handled each phase of the confrontation. Her approach became a template. Stay calm, document everything, prepare for likely attacks, and respond with facts rather than emotions. She didn't just defend herself, noted one veteran campaign strategist. She went on offense using nothing but verifiable information about her opponent's record. It was like watching a masterclass in political jiu-jitsu, using your opponent's attack against them. The incident also had immediate consequences within Congress itself. Democratic leadership, which had sometimes viewed Crockett as a talented but unproven freshman member, suddenly began seeing her as a major political asset. Within a week, she was being mentioned for high-profile committee assignments and leadership development programs. "What she did in that hearing room showed she has the kind of political skills and backbone that our party needs," said one senior Democratic leader, speaking anonymously. "She didn't just stand up to a bully. She systematically dismantled the bully's credibility while maintaining perfect composure. That's presidential-level political talent." Meanwhile, Blackburn found herself increasingly isolated within her own party. Republican senators who had previously seen her as a reliable conservative voice began distancing themselves from her comments. Several refused to appear at joint events with her, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were really about avoiding association with her damaged brand. The situation got worse for Blackburn when investigative reporters inspired by Crockett's revelations began doing deep dives into other aspects of her background and record. What they found wasn't pretty. A major newspaper published a detailed investigation into her business claims, confirming not only the tax issues Crockett had mentioned, but uncovering additional problems with other ventures she had been involved in. The story revealed a pattern of failed businesses, unpaid debts, and exaggerated claims about her entrepreneurial success. Another investigation looked into her attendance record and found that her absences from committee meetings were even worse than Crockett had stated. The newspaper found that over her entire Senate career, Blackburn had one of the worst attendance records of any member, missing crucial votes and hearings, even on issues she claimed to care deeply about. Most damaging of all was a follow-up story about her educational background. Reporters discovered that Blackburn had been claiming for years to have studied business at Mississippi State, but records showed she had actually been enrolled in a general liberal arts program and had earned mostly C's and D's in the few business courses she did take before dropping out. "She's been living a lie for decades," wrote one political columnist. Her entire persona as a smart, successful businesswoman who could outsmart anyone was built on fabrications and exaggerations. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose her in that hearing room. She exposed 40 years of political fraud. The revelations continued to pile up over the following weeks. Local Tennessee newspapers began investigating her claims about bringing economic development to the state and found that most of the projects she took credit for had actually been initiated by previous senators or state officials. Her own constituents began turning against her. Town halls that had once been friendly affairs became hostile environments where voters demanded answers about why she had attacked a colleague instead of focusing on Tennessee's problems. "I voted for her because I thought she was smart and would fight for us," said one voter at a town hall in Memphis. "But after watching that video, I realized she's just a bully who doesn't do her homework. How can she represent us if she doesn't even show up to meetings?" The political damage was so severe that within a month, 3 potential Republican primary challengers had begun exploring campaigns against her. Party donors who had supported her for years began quietly redirecting their contributions to other candidates. "She's become a liability," said one major Republican donor from Tennessee. "The party can't afford to have candidates who embarrass themselves on national television and then get exposed as frauds. We need candidates who can actually compete in the modern political environment." For Crockett, the aftermath continued to be overwhelmingly positive. She was invited to speak at major Democratic Party events, appeared on national television programs to discuss policy issues, and saw her national profile rise dramatically. More importantly, she was able to use her new platform to advance the policy agenda she cared about. The economic development bill that had started the whole confrontation passed the committee and eventually became law, bringing millions of dollars in investment to underserved communities across the country. "The irony is perfect," noted one political analyst. Blackburn tried to humiliate Crockett to stop her from advancing policies that help working families. Instead, she ended up giving Crockett a national platform that helped those policies succeed. The O story also inspired countless young women, particularly women of color, who saw Crockett's response as a model for how to handle discrimination and condescension in professional settings. "I'm not a politician, but I deal with people like Senator Blackburn in my corporate job all the time," wrote one woman on social media. "Watching Congresswoman Crockett handle that situation gave me ideas for how to handle the next person who tries to question my qualifications because of my age or race. Come prepared with facts, stay calm, and let their own record speak for itself." Social media was flooded with stories from women sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination and how Crockett's example had inspired them to stand up for themselves more effectively. The video became required viewing in business schools, law schools, and leadership development programs as an example of how to respond to personal attacks with professionalism and factual preparation. 6 months later, when political scientists conducted polling about the incident, they found that it had actually shifted public opinion about political discourse more broadly. Voters across party lines said they were more likely to support candidates who came prepared with facts and less likely to support candidates who relied on personal attacks. "The Crockett-Blackburn exchange became a watershed moment," explained one pollster. "It showed voters what political discourse could look like when someone refuses to accept disrespect and responds with substance instead of emotion. People liked what they saw." The long-term implications were even more significant. The incident became part of a broader conversation about changing generational dynamics in American politics, with younger politicians increasingly refusing to accept the condescending treatment that previous generations had endured. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a single confrontation, wrote one political historian. She helped establish new rules for how political discourse should work in the 21st century. She showed that preparation and professionalism could be more powerful than age and assumed authority. A year later, Blackburn announced she would not seek re-election to the Senate, citing a desire to spend more time with family. Political insiders understood that her decision was really about recognizing that her brand of politics was no longer viable in the modern era. Meanwhile, Crockett was being mentioned as a potential candidate for statewide office in Texas, with polling showing she would be competitive in races that Democrats hadn't won in decades. She went from being a freshman representative that most people had never heard of to being a national political figure in the span of 20 minutes, observed one campaign consultant. That's the power of being prepared when opportunity meets preparation. The story of that hearing room confrontation continued to be told and retold, becoming part of American political folklore. It was the moment when the old ways of doing politics, relying on intimidation, assumptions, and personal attacks, met the new ways: preparation, facts, and refusing to be silenced. And in that meeting, there was no question about which approach had won. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. In the age of social media and instant fact-checking, the politicians who succeed will be those who do their homework, stay prepared, and never underestimate their opponents. Because, as Marsha Blackburn learned the hard way, when you come for someone's intelligence, you better make sure you actually have the facts on your side. Thanks for watching this incredible political moment that changed everything we thought we knew about how political confrontations work in modern America. If you enjoyed seeing Jasmine Crockett deliver this masterclass in political communication and strategic preparation, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the explosive political drama that has everyone talking. What did you think of Crockett's response? Was this the most devastating political takedown you've ever seen? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what other political showdowns you'd like us to cover next. The political landscape is changing fast, and we'll be here to break down every shocking moment that shapes the future of American democracy and democracy.